Right, everyone. It is 2 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Good afternoon. I am Taylor Post, Swiftland's Office Manager, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Be a Manager and a Leader, Assertiveness for the Unassertive, and today's presenter, Linda Bruno. Linda Bruno has been developing and conducting training workshops for libraries and other organizations for more than 15 years. She offers workshops on topics ranging from leadership skills to returning balance and lots of areas in between. Linda received her MBA from the University of Florida and has years of experience in hands-on management positions. She develops her workshops based on solid research and, more importantly, real-life application. Linda is also certified with DDI and Achieve Global. Please welcome Linda and enjoy her webinar this afternoon. Linda?
Thanks so much, Taylor, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. I have a little bit of a confession to make. When I read this title, I wonder what the people would think who graduated from high school with me because I don't think there was an assertive bone in my body, or at least I had covered them very well at that point, just because of my background and things like that. And so I've had to learn this, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to help other people learn it. But I also want to be very clear that there is no switch here. This is not something where you attend a 60-minute webinar and you think, okay, got it. I never have to worry about that again. Because it's something that if it's not your natural bent, you're going to have to continue to work on it. One of the things I would highly suggest is that you print out your handouts. Taylor, I don't know if you saw Arnisha's note. It says it went to the host that she heard for a second but can't hear anything now. I'm going to just pass that along to you. So do print out your handouts. They came with the invitation to the webinar. And the reason I say that is on the second page of your handouts, we're going to look at a long list of areas that we might struggle with. And it's important for us to recognize which areas we might struggle with. So do print out your handouts. So assertiveness for the unassertive. Let me ask you a question. What do you think of when you think of being assertive? What comes to mind for you when you think of being assertive? What came to mind for confidence? Exactly, Dr. Rollins. Not shy, well spoken, someone who can get things done. You see lots of typing here. Empathetic too. Well, I lost my whole chat box for some reason. It went away and I need to get it back up there because I can't read any comments. Okay, here we go. Clearly stating what you need. Brave, gruff. Okay, Elizabeth, you just pulled something out that I wanted to point out because some of the things we talk about, for instance, somebody who can get things done, that definitely can be assertive, can it? But have you ever known somebody that gets things done either by manipulation or intimidation or kind of pushing you around? And I think it's really important for us to understand that there are some differences here. Claire said clearly stating what you need. Clearly stating what you need. And you don't have to do that in a negative tone of voice, do you, Claire? You just need to be assertive. We're going to look at some definitions here in a minute. I love the word brave. For some people who are naturally assertive, brave doesn't even come into the equation, does it? They just move through life that way. It's very natural for them. They don't have any struggles with them. Lucky them. For others of us, especially in certain situations, we have to pull from that bravery, don't we? Not afraid to speak up, stern. That can be the negative side of it, can it? Self-mastery, absolutely, Charlene. It absolutely plays a big part in assertiveness. Say what you need to say, but you got to say it in a kind way, right, Abby? You've got to say it in a tactful way, a diplomatic way. You don't have to dance around it. That's not being assertive. But there are lots of people in the world who go to the other side of assertive and they become aggressive. Yes, listening, Dr. Rollins, that's exactly what we have to do to be assertive. Because if we're just being assertive and we're not paying any attention to what the other person is saying, then in essence, we are being aggressive, even if we're speaking in a kind way. And the reason we're being aggressive rather than assertive, if we're not listening, is that We have pretty much made it clear that our opinion is the only one that matters, and what we say is what matters, rather than recognizing that there's somebody else in this conversation. Direct, exactly, Ruben. We need to be direct without crossing over the line. You will hear me talking about crossing over that line probably 15 times in a 60-minute webinar, because I know so many people that if you ask them, they would call themselves assertive. And yet, when they interact with people, they come across as very aggressive. So let's take a look at the differences between those terms. The first one, passive. And I think a lot of people who are trying to become more assertive are worried about being a passive person. And I know a lot of those in my life. And there have been some people who have just accepted that that's the way they are, that's the way they will always be. And they choose, because as somebody mentioned earlier, self mastery is huge in this, but these people choose not to have self mastery. And so they're passive. They accept whatever happens, what other people do. They don't really have much of a response, they don't resist it. They don't really take an active part in controlling that interaction. We would call them often a doormat, wouldn't we? My sister, who passed away last year, was very passive. And the danger with that was she had the tendency to fall into another category we'll look at in a minute, which was passive aggressive. And when she did that, because she would go along for so long, letting people use her as a doormat, being a victim, if you will, because that's one of her traits of being passive. Then when she had just had enough, she would explode and blow up at people, and they would have no clue what was going on, because she went, instead of becoming assertive in a situation and sort of demanding respect because she was handling herself so confidently, she would go to the other side of it and explode and still wouldn't get that respect that we all need. We all want respect from people. So think about whether your tendencies sway over to the passive side. That's where I was when I graduated from high school. Not necessarily because that's what my behavioral tendencies are that I was born with, but because of how I grew up. I grew up in a household that was sort of, you need to be seen and not heard. And so that was put into my brain for so many years that that's how I thought I should move through life. So being passive may be appropriate at certain points, but if we're passive on a regular basis, then we aren't going to get what we want out of life, are we? So the next one, as I mentioned, is aggressive. And I could name you people that would look you straight in the eye and tell you that they're just assertive. And that's probably the way they would say it. And you can hear in their tone, you can see by their facial expression, by the way they stomp around or move their arms or whatever it might be. I love this description, marked by combative readiness. They're just waiting to attack or confront you. And they're proud of it a lot of times. So we need to make sure that even when we're working in the passive to assertive stage, we don't cross over to this. And some of you in the room today may struggle with this part. Dr. Rollins said, me too. And I'm guessing that's from the you need to be seen and not heard comment, possibly. And, there are a lot of things that contribute to us being either passive or aggressive or assertive. Our behavioral tendencies, which is where that self mastery comes in. How can I pull out the strengths of who I am as a person and master those strengths to the point where I can be assertive? So we've talked about passive, we've talked about aggressive. I touched on passive aggressive, where you have negative feelings and resentment and aggression, but you don't really say too much. You maybe avoid people. You kind of dig in your heels. You pretend everything is okay, but then you do something that really irritates other people because you're not willing to voice how you're really feeling. Dr. Rollins says guilty but trying to change. Yeah, that's the whole point, isn't it? We need to be willing to change. And we need to accept responsibility. Write that down in the margins of your handouts because it's not about Linda Bruno talking to you today. It's not about you reading books on the subject or going to other workshops or reading articles. It's about us being willing to accept personal responsibility for any changes we want to make our journey through life better. I didn't say easier, I said better. So that at the end of a year, say, and I'm just using that as an example, we look back and say, you know, I handled a couple things really well this year. I will tell you, as I said, I struggle with the same thing. I don't struggle with it nearly as much as I did maybe even 20 years ago. But I had an instance maybe 10 years ago that happened that really settled into my brain as it's okay to be assertive. I was always taught to quote, respect authority figures. And the word respect really wasn't the true definition of it. It was more like kowtow to authority figures. You know, be passive, be a doormat. They always have authority over you. And so my husband was having some eye surgery one day, and he had had his 62 radiation treatments for his cancer. And so his throat was very dry and sticky. There was no recovering from that. The anesthesiologist pushed the tube down his throat 3 times trying to get the surgery started. When they called me back to the recovery room, they had aborted the surgery. There was blood running out of his mouth. He was as white as the sheet, and I started shaking. So my ophthalmologist called me over and he said, you know, I just need to tell you some of these guys are kind of cowboys, but he needs to be seen at the emergency room. He said, if you take him home and it swells up in the middle of the night, you aren't going to want the drama because he's not going to be able to breathe. And I'm already shaking. I'm already a nervous wreck. And so I approached the anesthesiologist because he was still the doctor in charge. And I said, I think he needs to go for a 23-hour observation at the ER. That's what my ophthalmologist had said. And that was a big step for me, folks. I mean, this guy has medical degrees. Linda Bruno doesn't know anything about medical stuff and still doesn't. But that was my husband laying there. So he said, I'm not going to send him to the ER. When his oxygen gets up to 93 or whatever, he said, we're going to send him home. And that made me mad. He was being aggressive. He was in my face, and I was pretty much toe to toe with him, maybe a couple of inches away. And I'm serious. I was physically about 2 inches away from him, and I said, "Look, you weren't there when he almost choked to death after radiation treatments. I want him to go for observation." He said, "Well, I'm not going to sign the papers." My ophthalmologist stepped up and he said, "I will." And he took control of the situation, signed the papers, and we went to the ER. Yeah, Eva, exactly. I just needed to do that, didn't I? Heather said suggestions for supervising someone who is passive aggressive. And by the way, anytime you need to dig a little deeper and go into a little more detail and you don't feel comfortable doing that in the chat box, you have my email address at the bottom of the first page of your handouts. You are always welcome to contact me, whether it's today or tomorrow or a year from now or whenever, because sometimes we can flesh it out a little bit more. And the reason I'm saying that, Heather, is I need to get a little more information from you as far as what the situations are, what's the background of that, what's the history, the backstory, and so forth. So if you would drop me an email, I would be happy to get back to you on that. Let me know a little bit more detail. I will tell you I'm leaving right after the webinar to go out of town to do a conference tomorrow. So it'll be Friday probably before I can get back to you, but I'm always happy to do that. And I'm going to also say it's not easy, that there are no right or wrong answers here because that person has chosen to be that way and they figure that's the best way for them to move through life. And so what we're trying to do is change them, but that doesn't always happen, does it? It doesn't always work. And so what we need to really look at is how are we interacting with them? And at some point, sometimes we have to say we are doing the best we can. The rest of it is their personal responsibility. Oh, Gabe, good. Please come up and say hello. I would appreciate it if you happen to be in any of my sessions and if you don't catch me in the hallway. So passive aggressive. It's, I think, one of the, as Heather has kind of indicated, most challenging of the descriptions that we're talking about today, because one thing is you never know which one they're going to be, do you? Because sometimes they'll be going along acting like they're agreeing with you when in reality they're not going to do what you ask. I had a lady that worked for me once, Heather, and I thought she was doing what I asked, and then One day I saw something that she did absolutely wrong and ended up having to write her up. And then I found out after she stomped out and quit, and I was the bad guy, of course, that she hadn't even been doing some of the work I had given her. Talk about passive aggressive. Dr. Rollins says, do you think being PA has anything to do with gender? You know, that's a very good question. But I will tell you, I've met males, and I'm thinking, Dr. Rollins, that you're thinking women have a tendency toward this, and I would probably agree with that. But I've also had some males in my orbit that have been passive aggressive. So I'm going to say there's probably a propensity for females to be more passive aggressive, but not nearly what we might think. That's my personal opinion. But when you said that, I immediately thought of two males that have been that way in their lives and didn't really acknowledge it. Gabe said, I believe passive aggressive people in the workforce is one of the worst personalities for a toxic work environment. It's very contagious amongst coworkers. Absolutely. It just leads to negativity, doesn't it? And negativity is what leads to that toxic environment, and it's very hard to overcome it. So I'm going to throw down the gauntlet for all of you in the room today. And one thing I'm going to say is don't buy into it. Don't engage it if you can help it. Now, if you're the supervisor, send me an email. We'll talk about that. But don't join that party. And I read a quote. Gosh, it's probably been a year ago. I wish I knew where I read it. It said, you don't have to join every argument you're invited to. And I thought, whoa, I like that a lot. Now, aggressive people not only want to join, they want to start them, right? The passive person pretends they're not joining, and then they go and do something sort of almost deviously to prove their point and to stand their ground. And yet it really doesn't prove anybody's point, and it doesn't help them stand their ground. So we can be responsible for our own responses to those kinds of things. Dr. Rollins says, I tend to be passive aggressive and personal, not so much at work. Is that strange? No, I don't think so at all. Dr. Rollins, I think that at work, we are much more willing to do what we need to do to get by. Let's just say it that way. Probably not the most professional way to say it. But in our personal lives, here's why I think we can be passive aggressive, because I've been there. They have to love us anyway. I know I was passive aggressive at times in my early years with my husband, God bless him, because he put up with the nothing's wrong kind of a thing, and you've seen those pictures, you've heard those jokes and it's usually the female saying, the male is saying what's wrong to the female, and the female is crossing her arms and stomping around saying nothing. And the male is saying, oh, good, then I'm off the hook, right? And he knows he's not. But, that's kind of very sexist, I know. But you get the drift on that. Ruben says, perhaps we could be a little of all four of these traits. Yes, absolutely, Ruben. It depends a lot on our situation, doesn't it? It depends on who we're around. It even depends somewhat on how we feel about the person we're interacting with. There have been situations in my life where I've interacted with somebody who has not treated me respectfully, and I find myself getting aggressive when that really is not me. So I absolutely agree with you that we could be a little of all four of those. And it does often depend on the situation. But we need to understand ourselves enough to know that we probably have a tendency toward one or the other. Yes, exactly, Ruben. And I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm looking at the accent there and hoping I'm pronouncing it right. We get swept, thank you. We get swept up in their vortex. That's a good word for it. Their hurricane, their tornado, whatever, their downward spiral, really. So again, please hear me clearly. You can control that. Can you control the feelings that come before you act? No. Those feelings are going to come into your brain. They're going to be there, and you're going to have to decide what to do with them. Sadly, the human species typically decides to go to the negative. So we have to say, okay, I recognize the thought is there. That's that self-mastery. It's called emotional intelligence. Some of you have heard me talk about that. I believe it's a foundational thing that we need to understand about ourselves before we can understand any of this other kind of stuff. Are we self-aware when that thought comes into our head? Oh, great, we're self-aware, but we still blow our stack. Well, that's not really being emotionally intelligent, is it? When we're self-aware and we can manage what we're going to do with that thought, that feeling, that emotion that flooded our brains and created all of those toxic chemicals, if you will, in our system, what are we going to do with that? Our natural tendency is to go to the negative. We need to stop it in its tracks to say, you know what, that may be my natural tendency, but I don't have to go there. So that's the passive aggressive part. The assertive part, this is what we all want to be. Bold, some of you mentioned the word bold. I think somebody mentioned the word confidence. Bold, confident statements having or showing a confident and forceful personality. Now, I'm going to disagree with that just a bit. The word forceful to me indicates it's almost in the aggressive category. I think confident is the word we're looking for here. Bold is okay as long as it's not bulldozer bold. You know what I mean? As long as I'm not being bold about you need to do this and da 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 da. That's bold, but it's not really assertive. It's just that calm, confident manner that you can have because you feel good about what you are doing, what you are saying, how you're acting, or whatever it is. You're reflecting on your own situation, not somebody else's. And so you're responding to yourself, not reacting to somebody else. So I want you to think about this. In what kinds of situations or what kinds of people do you need to improve your own assertiveness? Specific situations, not just I get upset. Think about specific situations. And if you can think of something that's not too personal, go ahead and type that into the chat box. Let's take a look at what we have in the room today. I see lots of you are typing at a party. That's an easy place to become passive, isn't it? Claire said, really emotional students, I tend to want to soothe everything over rather than point out where they've screwed up. And I understand that, Claire. And then we have to be careful not to not use empathy while we're telling them where they screwed up, because the empathy, somebody said earlier, comes into play when we're being assertive, doesn't it? We can say, I can see how that would be really upsetting for you. Let's look at how we can avoid that in the future. Let's look at what might have gone awry that we ended up at this position so it doesn't happen again. Something along those lines where we can be assertive and point out that something must have gone wrong to get us here, as in you waited till this morning to print, now the printer's not working. How can we avoid that in the future? Let's figure out how we'll fix it today, and then how can we avoid it in the future? And still have that empathy in there. Eva said, doesn't complete the task even though you mentioned it a few times. And if it's somebody that works for you, Eva, that becomes a supervisory problem in Linda Bruno's theory. Because in my mind, when people are insubordinate and not doing what I ask, that's a disciplinary action that needs to take place. And that then leads to, are we going to be passive about it and harumph around about it? Which a lot of people who are what's called peaceful phlegmatics in the wired that way behavioral tendencies, a lot of peacefuls will avoid confronting people about disciplinary issues at all costs, to the point where they actually aggravate other people who were doing a good job. And sometimes those other people become passive aggressive because they figure, what's the use? That person didn't have to do their job and they got away with it. So I'm going to get passive aggressive. I'm not going to do my job because what's she going to say to me? If Eva comes up and says, Linda, why didn't you do that? I'm going to say, well, Claire didn't do hers and you didn't get upset with her. Do you see how that becomes a vicious cycle? Talking to upset patrons, Kenneth, that's a tough one, isn't it? Because there are customers. Here's something I want you to remember when you're thinking about being assertive with upset patrons. They're not always right. They are always the patron or the customer in that language. You know, we always say the customer's always right. No, they're not. And we need to understand that. And it's okay to be assertive with them. For instance, if they get verbally abusive. Now, this depends, of course, on your library's rules and policies and procedures. But in my book, you should have permission to say, I We'll be happy to help you with this when you've had a moment to calm down. That's going to make them mad, and I understand that. But if you can say that calmly and repeat that calmly, that's assertiveness, isn't it? If you slam things around because you have to wait on them because they're being mean to you, that's passive aggressive. If you shout back at them, that's aggressive. It's very easy to slide into those other places, but you have a right to stand there and look them straight in the eye. I'm not saying your palms won't sweat. I'm not saying your stomach won't churn while you're doing this. But here's what I am saying. I will almost, I can't guarantee it for everybody in the room. I will almost guarantee once you start working on this, that once you've done that uncomfortable situation, for instance, talking to an upset patron, and you've been assertive about it, being kind, being respectful, being polite, but you're standing your ground, that you will be more comfortable doing it the next time because you're creating new pathways in your brain. You see, lots of us have had decades, me included, to let those pathways be, oh, I just won't say anything, or oh, I'll tell them. And we've created those pathways. When we start to create new pathways where our brain says, it's okay for me to be calm about this, I can handle this, I'm confident, I'm going to gain their respect through this. They may not like my answer. Then all of a sudden our brain goes, okay, I have a different path I can go down now. Ruben says, sounds silly, but when someone arrives late and I need to ask for a leave slip. Yeah, really shouldn't even have to do that, should you? But those are the kinds of things where it's hard to be assertive. I had to ask somebody for money the other day. It was a favor that I'm probably going to do for somebody, but I can't do a favor that's going to cost me hundreds of dollars. So I just said, and we were communicating by email, and I just said, okay, here comes the very delicate part, money. And I put ugh afterwards. But you know what? I had to think about that overnight before I could come up with a way to word it that it was assertive, that I'm confident that I deserve that money, that it's okay to do that without being offensive to anybody. Kathleen said dealing with passive aggressive people. Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? It's very, as somebody said, get swept up into that vortex. Gabe said being able to say no when I don't have the time or resources to complete an additional request from a supervisor. I tend to always say yes. So next time, Gabe, no problem with you saying yes. Say, I'd love to help with that. I've got these three things that if I don't start working on them today, they won't get done in time. Which one should I leave behind? So find a different way to say yes if you need to. But don't take it all on yourself because eventually it will result in you either being passive aggressive or assertive or aggressive possibly. Sarah says, I tend to agree with everything. So, yeah, it's an issue we need to deal with. The reason I ask you to identify those things is so that you know you have to take steps to manage them, don't you? Charlene said, I manage volunteers that are the family members of my employers. You must be very careful to apply assertiveness. Absolutely. Eva said, easy day-to-day tasks. Yes. Or not make a decision. Yes. Avoiding giving a direct, hard no and giving excuses instead. And I always tell people it's an excuse or a reason. Because if somebody gives me a reason, I'm going to ponder that and reflect on that and figure out what we need to do. But if somebody's just making an excuse, I actually asked a lady that worked for me once. She came in, she was always late. I shouldn't use the word always, but I'm talking 3 days a week late. And she came in one day, rushed in, her face was all red, and she said, I need to tell you why I'm late. The reason I'm late. And I looked at her and I said, is it a reason or is it another excuse? And I got to tell you, I went to kind of the aggressive side that day. And I felt that it was necessary. And she sort of looked at me like, what did you just say? She said, well, there was a train and I couldn't get around the train to get back from lunch. And I said, how long have you lived where you live? And she said, 8 years. And I said, how long has there been a train on that track? I got a little, I got a little passive aggressive. Actually, I don't think I was. I was very calm. I wasn't mean, but I just wanted to point out to her, you're making excuses. Eva said, I try to be more assertive and ask if maybe they have more questions. Yeah, a little too passive. A flat affect, continue to assist them. Yeah, that's about all you can do sometimes. Yes, exactly, Dr. Rollins. You can role play with a friend. I struggle with role plays personally just because I know it's a role play. And my brain sits there and goes, we're just pretending here, do whatever you need to do. But it does help to practice, doesn't it? Or I'm even going to throw that a little bit further. If you know you're going to have recurring issues, practice by yourself. You know what they're going to say. Practice by yourself. If a role play isn't effective for you or you don't have a friend you can trust to give you really honest, good, strong feedback, then just practice by yourself. Say to yourself, if I say this, she's probably going to say this. What am I going to do then? Because again, you are telling your brain there are other options here than to go the way you typically go. So now you recognize the situations you're in. What do you think might be behind your inability to be assertive in certain situations? Well, I kind of made a little bit of a list for myself, but there might be others you want to add to this. A lack of confidence is something that popped up for me in my mind when I wrote this question down on my notes, because it's something that I've dealt with all of my life and I still work on it, but I know that it can tend to throw me one direction or the other and not in the assertive direction. Intimidation can throw us either into the passive or the aggressive. Exactly, Ruben. A person you perceive to have more power, but see, you're equal. They may have more power, more authority in a job, and you have to be careful of that. But I think sometimes when we tell ourselves somebody has more power, we think they have the power to make our choices for us, and they don't. We need to think of ourselves as being equal to them, no matter what their status is, because there's a certain point where people are using these kinds of techniques intentionally, aren't they? Gabe said, my father was and is a very passive person. I've learned my habits from him. Yeah, and then you have to unlearn them, don't you? Because it's not serving you well. It doesn't mean you can't be quiet sometimes. You do not have to join every argument you're invited to. It just means that when there are times where you feel strongly about something or something definitely needs to be addressed, that's when you step up and you decide to pull out the assertive tools. Claire said, I want to make people feel better, and being assertive to disagree feels mean. Yeah, we're people pleasers, aren't we, Claire, sometimes? And that's okay to an extent unless it's not effective. Not wanting to be seen as rude or not nice. And here's the deal. If we're being assertive, and again, there comes that definition, we're not being rude or not nice. We're just being confident that this is the way it is. Somebody sent me a political message the other day, and I rarely engage in political messages, but this is somebody I've known for years and years and years. We've kind of been dancing around it for a while. And he sent me something pretty blatant. And I thought about it and I thought, you know what? I can't let that go because I have a strong opinion too. And so when I thought about it for a while before I responded, and when I responded, I said, "Gosh, I've got to disagree with you there." And then I just put out what I had, and I wasn't rude, and I wasn't nasty, and I wasn't said, "Are you kidding me?" or anything like that. Just being assertive in my own opinion. And his response came back, "Well said." And that's all he said to that one. He's still emailing me. We're good. We're still friends. But I thought I just don't want to let that pass. Lisa says, sometimes when I've been direct, the reaction was crying, so I try to avoid this situation. Okay, not your responsibility though, Lisa, right? I mean, it's sad that they do that, but you can address, I know this is going to be upsetting for you, but I feel I wouldn't be fair to you if I didn't address the situation because it's reflecting in your job. Being likable is a double-edged sword, absolutely. Caught in two minds, exactly. All of the above. Hurt feelings, that's just what you all were talking about. And I didn't even pay you to say that, right? Fear, because of the power difference that was mentioned earlier. They're all legitimate, folks. Recognize them so that you can decide what you're going to do with them. Is this a battle you want to fight? I think sometimes we need to make sure we're looking at it closely enough and not just automatically saying, no, it's not a battle I want to fight, because none of us ever wants to really fight that battle. So what might be the benefits? Well, I think improving our confidence, because as I mentioned, if you do this and do it something small, don't start out by arguing with your boss in a very assertive way. That's not really going to be a good way for you to start to practice this. You want to practice it in small ways where you can just say, oh, I'm sorry, I was first, or something like that, where you can just take control of the situation and you'll feel uncomfortable. Let me just be very honest with you. If you're not already there as far as being assertive all the time, when you try it, you will be uncomfortable. But once you've tried it, you can say, look at that. I didn't die. I'm okay. And I actually feel a little bit stronger than I did before I was assertive. So you're going to have improved confidence. You're going to have improved relationships because whether you're passive aggressive, or aggressive with people, you may be losing trust. You may be losing credibility. They may not care what you say. So you're going to improve relationships when you can grab hold of this. Recognition of your work is a benefit of improving your assertiveness. I know people, I've worked with people who are loud and boisterous and what you might say is bold in a negative way, who got all the attention for the work being done. And so sometimes you have to be assertive and make sure people know that you're doing that work too, or you're doing your work well. Greater self belief, absolutely, Jardine, which leads into the confidence. Sometimes you even save time or money. I've been with people who have had something happen in their meal and they won't say anything. They just don't eat it. And then they have to go to another restaurant and get something to eat. That's a waste of money, isn't it? And it really is a disservice to the restaurant. I was with a friend a few months ago. She had a piece of clear plastic in her vegetables that were served with her meal. And she said, I'm not going to say anything. And I said, well, I really don't think that's fair. I think you need to mention it to them just so they know. And so the waiter came to the table and she showed it to him. And he goes, oh my gosh, I'm going to take this back to the kitchen. She said, oh no, you don't need to do that. And I said, yes, he does. I was being assertive. It wasn't even any of my business, to be honest with you. But it didn't seem fair that somebody could have choked on something like that because somebody wasn't paying attention. So saving time and money, better health. Somebody alluded to the struggle that we have, the stress that we put ourselves under. So better health. Look at all of that list. Don't you think you would have a better chance to reach your potential in life in general, whether it's personal relationships, because this is just as important for personal relationships as it is for work, or your work, your professional development? All of this is going to lead to you reaching your potential easier, quicker, feeling better about it, probably reaching a higher potential because you're now willing to step out and be a little more assertive. So at the top of page 2, we kind of addressed this a little bit earlier, but just take a minute and go through that list of there's probably 12 or 15 items there. Some of you have already mentioned some of these, but I want you to check them. I want you to actually put a little check mark beside them so that this is looking you in the face, because you're not going to have the chat box to look at when we leave today. I want you to have something that you can look at that says, oh my gosh, this is a bigger issue for me than I had originally thought. So I'm going to give you a minute to do that and then we'll move on. Oh my gosh, as I read through that list, I see so many that we already saw in the chat box. All of the above, Ruben says. Yeah, at different times, right, Ruben? The first for sure. So many people, and we need to be willing to help, don't we, Glenn? We need to be just accommodating to people. And yet sometimes they use us, don't they? I know it's happened to me. And we start out, even sometimes this is going to be very, maybe too personal for some of you if I'm digging this deep for you. But sometimes we actually start out feeling good because people always come to us to ask for help, because we're the ones people go to, until about the 17th time they've done that. And somebody else that we work with didn't have to bother with any of that because they never help. And we just keep getting bombarded, don't we? So we start out by thinking that's a good thing. We feel pretty proud of ourselves until we realize that we're actually being used or manipulated or abused. Yeah, exactly, Ruben. They take advantage of us. Absolutely. So I just wanted that list there so that you would have something next month to look at if you get kind of in a bit of a funk because you're not being assertive. Go back and take a look at it and say, okay, this is the area that I'm struggling with. What am I going to do about it? That's what we're going to talk about next. What can we do about this? You're not going to like the first one. Let me just tell you that. Under tips to improve your assertiveness, you have to decide. I mentioned that right in the first 60 seconds, didn't I? I said it's a choice. And if it was comfortable, if it was fun, if we thought this was the greatest thing since sliced bread, we would be doing it all the time. But we aren't. So then that takes a decision that I am going to do it at least in X situation or at Y times whenever that happens. I may not be able to do it all the time. It may not be appropriate to do it all the time, but I can decide to do it maybe in these couple of situations, practice that till I feel a little more comfortable with it, and then ramp it up a bit. Kathleen said, I don't answer people when they ask nosy questions. I avoid and redirect. I understand that, Kathleen. That it feels very intrusive, doesn't it? I had lunch with a friend of mine who's a trainer a couple years ago. It's probably been 5 years ago now, actually. I mean, I've had lunch with her since then, but I can remember this conversation because we got our food at Zaxby's and we went to sit down. And as soon as I put my tray down, she says, So I hear they ask you to be the interim corporate training director. And I looked at her and I wanted to say, What's it to you? Honestly, Kathleen, that's what I wanted to say. It was nosy. And I just smiled and I said, Yeah, they did, but I don't have time in my calendar. And then I ask her a question. So it's okay sometimes to avoid if it's a nosy question that you don't want to answer. It's okay to say something very kind and assertive by saying something, Is there a reason you needed to know? That's not passive aggressive if you really mean that. Maybe there is a reason they need to know. But if there's not, then they probably won't ask you any more nosy questions. So you need to decide that you're going to improve your assertiveness. We talked about emotional intelligence. Any change you want to make is going to require self management, isn't it? That self mastery somebody mentioned earlier. You've got to take hold of it yourself and say, I'm never going to be perfect at this. It's just not the way I'm made. But I know I can improve because there's nothing stopping me from improving except my response or reaction to people. So it has to come from self management for you to be able to do this. Listen to understand, not reply. And when I talk to people about listening, this is the number one reason, according to studies, that we don't listen well because we are forming our own reply. And really, if we're listening to understand as we're trying to be assertive, somebody said that earlier. I think Dr. Rollins said we need to be listening to be assertive. Because if I attack you about something you said in the first three words and I'm not listening to the rest of it, then that's not being assertive. That's being aggressive. Or if I shut down because of something you said in the first three words, that's not going to be helpful. Gabe said, many are just waiting for you to finish so they can speak. That's exactly right. They're waiting to reply, aren't they, Gabe? Rather than listening to what you are actually saying. And we do it too. It's a human thing. Hopefully, we don't do it as often as other people because we're in this room willing to learn. So we try to avoid that. Sometimes you need to agree to disagree. And that's being assertive too, isn't it? You can say, I've even had this happen to me in workshops, face-to-face workshops, which is a dreadful situation. I'm standing there, I'm talking to somebody, we're having a good discussion, and somebody, I call it heckling, somebody just takes everything I say and twists it around and disagrees with it. And that happened one day, and it was somebody that I respect this person. They're very bright, very knowledgeable, but they were disruptive. And it was about something that I had studied as well. And according to what I studied, what I had there was correct. And I just looked at him and smiled and I said, I think we're going to have to agree to disagree. That was being assertive. I wasn't passive. I'm not going to go down that road with you. I'm not going to join that argument with you. I'm not going to engage. And I'm not going to stomp around and be upset because you were being disruptive. I'm just going to say, I think we need to agree to disagree. And then I physically turned my body a little bit to somebody else in the room to address a question they had. That was part of that being assertive. So sometimes it's okay to agree to disagree. Be willing to be honest and just say, that's making me a little uncomfortable. I can remember years ago when I was in my corporate job, I was sitting around a round table at a sales meeting, And the owner of the company told a joke that was just a touch off color, nothing drastic. I just sat there. It was all men. There were 7 or 8 men and me because there were only 5 women probably at the whole sales meeting. And then one of the other guys chipped in and it got a little worse. And by the time the third one started his story, I could see where it was going. And I just pushed back my chair and I said, I think it's time for me to leave. And I just smiled at all of them and walked away with the risk, because the owner was sitting there, that he would be offended that I walked away. But I had to earn respect from the people at that table, didn't I? So that was being assertive. It was a little scary, but I needed to be assertive. And I didn't want to listen to that kind of talk. Practice staying calm. In situations where you normally get upset, know what those are, recognize them, and just say, you know what? I don't have to join this argument just because I was invited. I'm just going to stay calm. In conflict, which some of you have alluded to, look at it from a problem solving approach rather than, uh-oh, we're in conflict. That word needs to be struck from our language, because as soon as somebody says conflict, everybody's antenna goes up and they get all upset and it's a negative thing and we're going to be mortal enemies now. No, it's just a problem we need solved. I know this upsets you as much as it does me. What are some options we have here? Would that not sound like an assertive statement? Instead of, I can't believe you think that's what's going to happen, or whatever. What are some options we have here? Number 8 says practice with a friend, as Dr. Rollins said earlier. If you've got a friend that will be honest with you, that won't nitpick you, that won't tell you you're the most wonderful person in the world and you couldn't possibly ever do anything that would be passive or aggressive, then practice with that friend. But certainly you can always practice yourself. Strengthen your stress strategies, because you know what? When you try this assertiveness stuff, it doesn't mean that the stress goes away, does it? Sometimes the assertiveness actually creates some of the stress because you're not used to doing that. So what are you going to do to deal with the stress? Because if you don't figure out what to do with the stress, you'll avoid it next time. You won't try assertiveness next time. Be aware of your body language and your tone. If I am stomping around saying that'll be fine, but I've got tight lips and my jaw's clenched and I'm all tense, then obviously I'm being passive, aren't I? On the verge of being passive aggressive, because I'm probably going to leave and do something that is going to go against what you would have wished for me to do. Absolutely, Gabe. 90% of all communication is nonverbal. Whether we're face to face, even if we're on the phone, a lot of it's nonverbal, because people, I always joke, people can hear you roll your eyes. That's passive aggressive, but I believe they can hear it on the phone. Understand that being outspoken is not always assertiveness, as I mentioned earlier. It can be, certainly, if you're confident and calm and you're listening and doing all the things we've talked about. But if you're outspoken and talking over the top of people and insisting that your way is the only way, that is not assertiveness, is it? Last one at the bottom of page 2, learn to present your thoughts and ideas directly. It's very frustrating for people when you just spoke for 5 minutes and they don't really know what you said because you walked around it so much because you were afraid you would upset somebody. And they're thinking at the end, I wonder what that person really wants us to do. Just say it directly. That the other people can say yes or no, or you can have a discussion about it. But if you don't say it directly, you could waste that time and money we talked about earlier. Do not withdraw or pout. And I put this one in there because you might as well put my autograph next to this one, because that's what I used to do all the time. I haven't gotten over it 100%. I am over most of it. And I joke now that my recovery time is so much quicker. When something upsets me and I'm not sure how to address, Dr. Rollins said with my husband, me too. Dr. Rollins, we need to sit and have a conversation sometime, because I can remember a specific situation where I clammed up. This wasn't that long ago. We were together 38 years before he died. I clammed up about something he said. He knew as soon as he said it, I wouldn't take it wrong. I knew when he said it, he didn't mean it that way. And yet, because of the core of me having low self-esteem, that's how I took it. So I walked out of the room. I didn't speak to him the rest of the day. I wasn't mean or anything about it. I was reflecting, and he knew that. I just went off by myself. I'm an introvert. I needed to process it. So I went off by myself and I processed it. And the next day I said, I need to apologize for the way I responded to what you said, but here's why it hurt me. And he said, I knew as soon as I said it, I shouldn't have said it because he had no intent to say that. But my recovery was quicker. I actually started recovering almost instantly. It just took me a while to process why I was feeling this way. And it's a great question to ask yourself, folks. When somebody makes you feel like you're not worth saying something or you can't possibly give your own opinion or whatever, why are you feeling that way? Understand yourself first. Remember, we talked about that. Learn to say no. Somebody mentioned that. I say yes to everything. And then you get upset about it. But guess what? If you say yes, what are they going to keep doing? They're going to keep coming back and giving you some more stuff because you said yes. Why would they think otherwise? Right? We have to be honest with what the expectations we are setting up with other people when we say yes all the time. They're going to give us more. Kathleen said, I found that I frequently need a moment before answering something in order to be assertive, and that's perfectly okay. Exactly, Dr. Rollins keeps giving me more work. But Kathleen, it's okay to think for a moment. You know what? If most of us thought for a moment before we answered anything, the world would be a better place, wouldn't it? And now that social media is out there and people can just type whatever they want and spout out all this stuff, we have less of a filter than we used to. I think, Kathleen, that's a great thing to have that filter before you can answer to something. Accept and capitalize on the idea that assertiveness is learnable. Understand that. It's not a magic wand. I do have a magic wand, by the way. It's worth what I paid for it, which was $1.29, because it's not effective. But assertiveness is learnable. Know what you want before you ask. If you need to ask for something from your boss or do a presentation and ask for something or whatever, know what you want your expectation to be at the beginning so that you're always working toward that and not getting sidetracked. Don't be in the habit of apologizing because this is that passive piece, isn't it? I'm sorry to ask you this, or I'm sorry I don't agree with you, or I'm sorry, blah, blah, blah. There are times to apologize. Certainly in our society today, we could use more of that. But don't get in the habit of thinking you always need to apologize because your viewpoint isn't worth anything or what you have to say is not valuable. That's not true. Kathleen says it's very important to know what you want, otherwise, you're just complaining. Exactly. So don't get in the habit of apologizing. Find ways to build your own confidence, whatever that is. Learn a new skill, take up a hobby, whatever that might be. Something that will build your confidence. And certainly practicing assertiveness will do that for you. Expect a yes. I think sometimes we come across to people, and I'm going to word it this way. You don't really want to do this, do you? We may not say those words, but that's how it comes out. I'm sorry to ask you to do this. Well, you just told me I have permission to say no. So expect a yes. I would love your help with this because you're so good at this. Not to manipulate, but just expect the yes because you're saying it in an assertive way. You'll need to be intentional about this. I didn't use the word intentional at the beginning, but I told you you have to decide. You have to make a choice. You've got to be intentional. Respect yourself. I think for me, this is one of the areas that it has taken me so many years to get a little farther along that continuum for myself. Nobody else is going to respect Linda Bruno unless Linda Bruno respects herself. So I have to do that. And sometimes in order to do that, I have to remember to tell myself why I deserve that respect. If it's going to help you, plan what you'll say. Oh, I look, that mistake, what your will say. Please take that R off of there in your mind and don't see that. If it'll help your mindset, plan what you're going to say. That's what we talked about earlier. I've even had people who told me they took this to the next step and they actually wrote down a couple notes so that if they got distracted, they could be pulled back into what their intent was and what their expectation was. Take responsibility for your own feelings. Like I said earlier, are you angry? Why? Are you hurt? Why? Are you afraid? Why? Deal with the whys, and that will help you become more assertive in that particular situation. Otherwise, you're just shooting in the dark. This is actually a picture of my kitty's eyes. Isn't that pretty? She has such pretty eyes. Assertiveness in person requires eye contact. When you're not maintaining eye contact with people, they sense that they can kind of walk all over you, or they sense that they can't trust you, or whatever it might be. So make sure you're maintaining eye contact. Another thing that is not always easy to do. Don't interrupt thinking that that's being assertive. It's being rude. We all do it, don't we? We finish each other's statements, or there's a pause because that person can't think of what to say and we fill in the blank. And sometimes that's okay, not a big deal, but don't interrupt thinking that that's being assertive. Practice differentiating the matter from the person, because so many times it's that person's attitude or their behaviors or their tone or whatever it is. And that's what we get all wrapped up in, isn't it? And by golly, you're not going to treat me this way. What are they saying? Maybe what they're saying has validity. Maybe we need to take that apart a little bit instead of worrying about whether or not they're treating us the way we feel we should be treated. Assertiveness is about feeling free to express your own opinion. Again, not in an aggressive way, just this is how I feel. I understand we're not going to be able to change this, but I did want to go on record as saying, here's how I feel about this. It's okay to say that. If you say, well, I just want to go on record saying I don't agree with that, that is not being assertive. Same words, different tone, different attitude. That is not considered being assertive. It's not about eliminating differences. We don't want to do that. It's about being able to handle them and express them with respect. One aspect for you may be knowing how to set boundaries with people. For instance, a yes no issue, or the boundary of I'm going to express my opinion and I'm not in your own head. You're saying I'm not going to allow you to make me feel less than because of that boundary. That's my boundary. Not going there. I'm worth having my own opinion. And number 30 says it doesn't equal being disrespectful. There's no need to ever be disrespectful if you're being assertive. I've never heard of a situation where somebody was assertive. Now, the other person might have perceived it that way. Again, their choice. Nothing you can do about that. But if you've been kind, you've been empathetic, you've been compassionate, you've listened to their viewpoint, and you just expressed whatever you thought in a calm, confident manner, then you have not been disrespectful, even if they think you have because you disagree with them. So give yourself permission to disagree with them, to have your own opinion. And number 31 says, whatever is at the root of your unassertiveness, know that you are enough. You are enough to stand up for your viewpoint. You are enough to ask for what you need. You are enough. I want you to think about one thing you're going to do to develop your assertiveness. We talked about quite a few things here. What's one thing that you haven't been doing that you can do to develop your assertiveness? Would you type it into the chat box, please? Exactly, Ruben. It is a vital part of the mantra to know that you are enough. Judy's going to say no more often. Dr. Rollins is going to speak up, period. Don't freeze. Oh, it's so easy to freeze, though. We always said fight or flight, and freeze is the third option that psychologists tell us we have learned to use. We freeze. I love this. State my opinions in ways that are effective and not overbearing. Don't wait up to speak on things. Learn to say no. Practice. Smile and say good morning to those who may not be that pleasant. Try to say no if I'm really too busy. Stop overthinking things. Include my conduct and my intent, the problem that I want to solve. Speak out. Stop preambling my statements. There you go. I'm sorry to ask this, but I like that word. Stop preambling your statements. Don't overthink it. Work on confidence. Reduce the amount. You all have some great things you've got to work on, don't you? Nothing huge. Look at that. That list is not monumental, is it? Any single item on there that you chose to work on is not something that's unsurmountable. It just takes courage a little bit, doesn't it? And that intentionality we talked about. Reduce the amount of times I apologize for things out of my control. Exactly. If they're out of your control, no need for an apology. I'm going to work to state what I need when I want to smooth things over. Stop apologizing. I've heard that several times. Be prepared so I'm more confident. All of the above, right? So hopefully you've got something you can take away from today and work on. And don't forget, you can always drop me a line. Absolutely, Ruben. You absolutely. Somebody mentioned that earlier. We can transfer these behaviors to our children. We learn that way, don't we? If the people all around you don't know your real thoughts, feelings, joys, desires, struggles, needs, and ambitions, that's on you. Ah, Linda, you're being a little assertive there. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. I hope this was helpful to you. Please let me know if there's any other way I can help, and I look forward to seeing you in the future. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Linda, for an informative webinar. Attendees, if you enjoyed this webinar, we ask that you join us on September 6th for Linda's webinar, Be a Manager and a Leader, Encouraging Stories in Your Library. As always, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland CE calendar, the Swiftland Facebook page, or your message from the listserv. Thank you everyone for attending and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Deb. Thank
Thanks,
you, Linda.
Taylor. Thank you, Deb. And thanks, everybody, for the